Hi, my name is Abraham, and today we're going to talk about the Old Testament. What is the Old Testament, and how is it relevant to us today as Christians? A lot of times we think of the Old Testament as some background information, but the real meat of the story is in the New Testament. And today I'd like to share with you why I think that's not true. First of all, the early church only had access to the Old Testament, and they completely preached out of the Old Testament. So it's teeming, it's just packed full with relevant information for us today as Christians. So before I get too far ahead of myself, let's go into the Old Testament, and then I'll talk about why I consider it a foundation for preaching about Christ. The Old Testament is divided into 5 sections here. And first we have the Pentateuch. This talks about the history of mankind and the formation of God's people. So it starts with Adam, it goes into Noah, his 3 sons, and talks about the generations of those, of specifically Shem, who has Abraham. Abraham has Isaac and Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons who become the tribes of Israel. The 12 sons move into Egypt, and they grow as a nation in Egypt, but then they are expelled when they're too big for Egypt, and they are birthed through the waters with the help of Moses as their leader. And then we go into the history portion in Joshua, where Moses passes away and Joshua takes charge. And then we have the history of the nation being established with judges, and then later on with kings, and the different types of judgment that was passed on them, and how they reacted, and how they grew as a nation, how they interacted with the nations around them. And then we have the wisdom literature that contains a lot of important cultural artifacts, but also, again, prophecies about Jesus coming forward as the Messiah. We see echoes of that for sure in the major prophets and the minor prophets. The only difference between the major and the minor prophets is really the size of the books the size of the books. The content is still just as significant either way. And so we have the major prophets, that especially Isaiah, that talks a lot about the coming Messiah. And then we have the minor prophets. Now, I want to go into some examples from the New Testament on how the Old Testament was used and how it's relevant to how we should be using it today as believers. Jesus sets the example of facing temptation with the Old Testament. So he's baptized, he's full of the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit drives him into the wilderness to be tempted. And as he's being tempted, he does a very interesting thing, because we may think, oh, it's Jesus. All he has to do is say the word and it's done. He just commands evil spirits to leave. But that's not the case. He sets the example by quoting from Deuteronomy each time, every time. And in doing that, finally, Satan leaves, and then he starts his ministry. Jesus goes into the synagogue, and again, what does he do? He pulls out a scroll. He doesn't just say, okay, I have some new things for you. No, he says, I have relevant information for you right now of what happened in Isaiah, or what Isaiah talked about is now. So we can see that the Old Testament isn't actually old news. It's happening right now. Additionally, afterwards, when Jesus is crucified and then he's resurrected, and people aren't sure what happened, he meets these 2 folks on the road to Emmaus, and he talks to them. They aren't sure what happened. Have you heard of Jesus? He was a great teacher. And he says, he opens, it says in Luke chapter 24, he says, and beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. He says, no, he doesn't say new things about himself. He says, this has already been spoken about. And so he preaches the gospel and the story of himself to them. And they say, we just encountered Jesus. Wasn't your heart burning in you when we heard what he taught us concerning himself? And then we have in Acts chapter 2 another really important and relevant thing where Peter stands up and he begins to preach. And this is the very beginning of the church really being birthed, where Peter speaks and says, Prophet Joel talked about this, that the Holy Spirit would be poured out. And that's how the church is birthed. And then my final example here is in Acts chapter 8, where Ethiopian eunuch is riding by and he's reading from Isaiah, the Old Testament. And Philip doesn't say, okay, well, that's cool and it's relevant, but I'm going to tell you something new. No, he says, I'm going to tell you what that says and how it's happening right now. And so the word old in Old Testament is really not correct. I mean, it's okay to call it the Old Testament, but we have to understand why it's called the Old Testament. It's older than the writings that we have currently, but it is currently happening. And so the Ethiopian says, what's stopping us from being baptized right now? What's stopping me from being baptized? And he's baptized. So we see in the Old Testament all of the content. Isaiah, David, Jacob, Abraham, Micah, Zechariah, they all talk about what's happening right now in our lives. So this is what I'm saying to you. The Old Testament isn't irrelevant for us today. It is Christian literature.